A werewolf romance written by Olivia Smith. Prologue. The night I stopped getting up, the sky did something strange. It turned the color of a wound, deep red, bleeding into black at the edges, like the moon itself was holding its breath. I had taken the hits before. I had taken them in the yard, in the kitchen, in the mud behind the pack house, while others watched from windows and looked away. I had learned how to fall without making a sound, because making a sound meant showing them it was working. But that night, that final night, I didn't fall like someone who was going to rise again. I fell like a woman who had finally decided that the ground was the safest place she had ever known. I didn't know that somewhere beyond the tree line, beyond the mountains I had never been allowed to cross, a man with eyes like burning amber was already moving, already coming. Not because someone sent for him, but because something ancient, something written into the marrow of the world, had finally screamed loud enough for him to hear it. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Chapter 1. The Night. She stopped getting up the boot connected with my ribs the same way it always did, not with rage, but with routine. That was the part nobody ever understood when I tried to explain it in my own head late at night. Rage would have meant emotion. Rage would have meant I was worth the feeling. What Caden Voss brought to our yard every evening before dinner was something colder than rage. It was habit. The way a man kicks a stone out of his path without thinking. I was the stone. I had been the stone for 3 years, ever since his father declared that I, Seraphine Lowe, the unmated, unmarked, low-ranking female with no wolf and no confirmed bloodline, would serve the Voss family until my debt to the Thornfield pack was paid. Nobody ever told me what the debt was. Nobody ever showed me a number or a record. The debt simply existed, the way the mountains existed, the way the cold existed, permanent and without explanation. I hit the ground and tasted iron. The dirt was familiar against my cheek. It smelled like pine root and old rain. I focused on that smell, the way my mother had taught me to focus on something real when the pain tried to pull me under. My mother, Ilara Lowe. She had died in this same yard, on ground just like this, with her cheek pressed to dirt that smelled like pine root and old rain. I was 11 years old when I watched her fall and not get up. I was 22 now, and for 11 years I had promised myself I would not be her. I would not give this pack the satisfaction of breaking me the way they broke her. So I had gotten up. Every single time I had gotten up. 73 mornings with cracked ribs. 41 nights with split lips. 19 times with vision so blurred the pack house looked like it was underwater. I had counted every single one, because counting was the only power I had left. Numbers didn't lie. Numbers didn't look away the way the pack members looked away. And so I counted. And I rose. And I counted again. But tonight, something inside me had shifted. Quietly. The way a foundation shifts before a building falls. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a slow, silent rearrangement of everything that had been holding me together. Caden crouched down beside me. I could smell the pine resin on his boots, the whiskey on his breath, the entitled laziness that lived permanently in his scent. He wasn't the alpha. His father, Doran Voss, was the alpha of Thornfield, a man so controlled and calculating that he never touched me himself. He simply allowed. Caden was the allowance made flesh. He grabbed a fist of my hair and tilted my face toward the dying light. You want to tell me again that you don't know what your mother left behind? His voice was almost gentle. That was the worst part. When it was gentle, it meant he had patience tonight. It meant this wasn't ending soon. I looked at him and said nothing. My silence had become my only territory, the one small piece of ground that belonged entirely to me. He could have my ribs. He could have my blood. He could not have my voice unless I chose to give it. He dropped my face back into the dirt, disgusted. One day, he said, standing, you're going to decide that secret isn't worth this. He walked away, and his boots faded across the yard, and the red sky watched him go. I lay there after he left, and I listened to the sounds of the pack settling into dinner inside the warmly lit pack house. Laughter drifted through the window. The sharp, bright sound of a child asking for more bread. The deep rumble of Doran Voss commanding silence with a single word. Normal sounds. Pack sounds. The sounds of belonging? I had never once eaten at that table. In 3 years I had eaten in the cold storage room off the kitchen, alone, before the others sat down. I had slept on a cot in the basement. I had washed my own wounds at the outdoor pump because I was not permitted in the medical ward. And through all of it, every exclusion, every blow, every cold meal, I had held one thing close. One name, not my name, not yet. A name that was buried inside my blood like an ember inside ash. A name my mother had pressed to my ear on the night she died. A name so dangerous she had whispered it with her final breath. I had never spoken it aloud. Not once. Not even alone in the dark. Tonight, lying in the dirt with the red sky bleeding overhead, and my ribs sending white fire through every breath, something changed. Not outside. Inside. Some last wire had snapped. Some final wall had come down. I pressed my palm flat against the earth, prepared to push myself up the way I had done 73 times before. And my arm simply would not obey. It shook. It buckled. I went back down, and I stayed there. The ground held me like it had been waiting, and somewhere beyond the mountains I had never been allowed to cross, in a direction I could not name, I felt something move. Something vast and ancient and furious, like a storm that had been sleeping for years and had just opened its eyes. I didn't know what it was yet. I only knew that it was coming. And for the first time in 3 years, I was too broken to be afraid. Chapter 2. What my mother buried in me. 3 years before Caden Voss learned my name, I was someone else entirely. I was the girl who ran barefoot through the silver grass fields at the edge of Marin's Hollow, the small borderland settlement where my mother had raised me in deliberate, careful obscurity. Marin's Hollow was not on any pack map. It was not claimed by any alpha. It existed in the forgotten seam between 3 pack territories, Thornfield to the north, Iron Vale to the east, and the Ashbourne lands to the west, which had been leaderless for so long that most wolves had stopped believing they were real. My mother chose that seam deliberately. She had grown up in a world of power, and she had run from it, and she had chosen the one place that no power had bothered to claim. She built us a small stone house with a low door and a garden of medicinal herbs along the south wall. She taught me to read, to wrap wounds, to move quietly through forest without snapping branches. She taught me to keep my head down in the presence of wolves who outranked me, and to never, under any circumstance, let anyone test my blood. That last instruction she gave me the way you give someone a law, not a suggestion. I had not understood it then. I was a child, and she was my mother, and her word was the whole world. But I obeyed with the easy obedience of someone who doesn't yet know what they're protecting. I kept my blood private. I refused the 3-pack census takers who came through Marin's Hollow over the years. I gave false names to strangers. I wore long sleeves even in summer, not because she asked me to, but because she had looked so relieved the first time I did it without being told. She was always watching, always calculating the distance between us and the nearest danger. I thought she was afraid. I know now she was strategic. There is a difference, and it took me until I was lying in Thornfield dirt to finally understand it. Ilara Lowe was not a frightened woman. She was a woman who had chosen her battlefield very carefully, and had spent my entire childhood building me into a weapon she hoped would never need to be used. The night she died, I had gone to the southern field to collect moonbloom, a herb she used for sleep remedies she traded with the Hollow's other families. I was gone, perhaps an hour. When I returned, the house was cold, and 4 men stood in our garden, their boots crushing her herb rows. My mother was on her knees in the low doorway, her hands pressed together in the composed, dignified posture she used when she was most afraid. One of the men wore Thornfield colors, green and iron gray. He was broad, older, with the bearing of a ranked wolf, and he looked at my mother the way men look at things they have already decided to take. I stood frozen at the field's edge, and she saw me. Just once her eyes flicked to mine, and in that single glance, she sent me a message so clear it needed no words. Stay still. Stay hidden. Do not let them see you. I obeyed. I stood inside the silver grass, and I watched, and I did not make a sound. And that is a silence I have carried in my chest like a stone ever since. They took her inside. I couldn't see what happened. I could only hear the low, controlled sounds of someone being questioned with force, not screaming because my mother did not scream, but the specific rhythm of impact and pause that I would come to know intimately in the years that followed. After a long time, the men left. I ran to the house. She was on the floor beside the cold hearth, her breathing shallow and wet, her hands still composed even now, folded against her chest, like she had arranged them herself. She looked at me, and she did not waste words on grief. She pulled me close, and she pressed her lips to my ear, and she told me the name. One name. Just a name. But the way she said it, the weight she placed on every syllable, the fierce care in her ruined voice, told me it was not just a name. It was a key. It was a locked door. It was the reason those men had come, and it was the only thing that could explain every strange instruction of my entire childhood. She made me repeat it once. Then she was gone. I buried her myself, in the silver grass field where she had always been happiest. I was 11 years old. I patted the dirt flat with my bare hands, and I sat with her until the stars came out, and then I stood up, and I made a promise to the open sky. I would carry the name, I would protect it, I would not speak it, and I would not sell it, and I would not break, no matter what came. I kept that promise for 11 years. I kept it through hunger and cold and homelessness, through the year I spent drifting between hollow settlements until Thornfield scouts found me and brought me in, through every single day of my captivity in this pack that had decided I owed them something without ever explaining what. I kept it through 73 mornings of cracked ribs and 41 nights of split lips. But tonight, in the dirt, with that last wire snapped and my arm refusing to obey me, tonight I felt the name shift inside my blood, like it was waking up, like it had been waiting all this time for exactly this breaking point. Chapter 3. The ones who watched and said nothing. Not everyone in Thornfield was cruel. That was the complicated part, the part that made the whole thing harder to carry than if they had all simply been monsters. Monsters were easy. You hated them cleanly, and that hatred kept you warm. But Thornfield had people like Ren Aldis, the pack healer's assistant, who slipped extra bread under the cold storage door on nights when the temperature dropped below freezing. She never spoke to me directly. She never looked at me in the yard when others were present. But the bread appeared, and I knew whose hands had left it, because it always smelled faintly of the yarrow and calendula she worked with all day. Ren was not cruel. Ren was terrified, and there was a version of me that understood that terror completely. Understood it from the inside, the way you understand a language you were raised in. Fear made people invisible. It made them small and quiet, and desperately hoping that the danger would choose someone else today. I had been afraid like that, but I had chosen a different response to my fear. Not everyone could. Then there was old Mattis Howern, the packhouse groundskeeper who was 70 years old and walked with a cane carved from white birch. Mattis had been at Thornfield longer than Doran Voss had been Alpha. He had seen things. He never spoke of them, but they lived in his eyes. A deep, permanent sorrow that went beyond old age into something more specific. He watched me the way someone watches a fire they know they should put out, but cannot bring themselves to approach. Sometimes, when I was working in the yard and Caden's attention was elsewhere, Mattis would sit on the far bench and carve small figures from spare wood, a deer, a bird, a running wolf, and leave them near where I worked. Not gifts exactly, more like company, like his way of saying, I see you. I cannot stop this, but I see you and I am sorry. I kept every figure he left. I hid them in a cloth pouch sewn inside my mattress, and on the worst nights I held them in the dark and counted them the way I counted my injuries, because counting was the only power I had. Doran Voss was the one I studied most carefully. He was not loud the way Caden was loud. He was the quiet center around which all the cruelty organized itself. Tall, silver-templed, with a face that showed nothing and missed nothing. He moved through Thornfield like a chess player moves through a game, several moves ahead, deeply patient, absolutely certain of the outcome. He had taken me in 3 years ago, not out of malice, but out of calculation. My mother had been connected to something he wanted, and I was the thread he was pulling slowly, waiting to see what unraveled at the other end. He was not in a hurry. That was what made him dangerous in a way Caden would never be. Caden wanted results now, driven by temper and impatience. Doran was willing to wait years. He had already waited years. The men who visited our cottage in Marin's Hollow had worn Thornfield colors, and I had understood for a long time, though I had never confirmed it aloud, that Doran Voss had sent them. There was one more person I watched. A girl named Thessaly Voss, Caden's younger sister, 17 years old, with her father's calculating eyes and her mother's soft face making an unsettling combination. Thessaly did not participate in what happened to me, but she watched. Always watched. From the upper window of the pack house, from behind door frames, from across the training yard, with an expression I could never quite decode. Not pity, not contempt. Something more complicated. Something that looked, if I let myself believe it, like guilt. She had once, only once, paused near me in the kitchen corridor when we were both alone. She had stopped, and she had opened her mouth, and something had clearly been building behind her teeth, ready to emerge. Then she had heard footsteps coming, and her face had closed like a shutter slamming, and she had walked away without a word. I thought about that moment constantly, what she had almost said, what had been that close to existing. It felt important in the way that things feel important before you understand why. This was the world I had survived in for 3 years. Not a simple world of monsters and victims, but a complicated world of fear and complicity and small kindnesses that couldn't add up to rescue. And the night I stopped getting up, the night I lay in the dirt with that last wire snapped inside me. These were the faces that moved through my mind like lantern slides. Wren's bread, Mattis's wooden figures, Thessaly's almost words, Doran's patient, calculating patience, and Caden's boot, connecting with my ribs the way a man kicks a stone out of his path. I lay there and I let myself, for the very first time, stop fighting. Not surrender. Surrender was an act of will. This was simpler than that. This was exhaustion so complete it had become its own kind of peace. And in that peace, in that absolute stillness, I felt it again, that distant movement beyond the mountains. Closer now, much closer. Coming through the dark like a thunderstorm that had already decided where it was going to land. Chapter 4. The name in my blood. My mother called it the sealed name. She explained it to me only once, the night before the men came, as though some part of her had known and had wanted to give me the knowledge before it was too late. We were sitting at the table after dinner, and she was quiet in that particular way she had when she was about to say something that cost her something. She poured 2 cups of tea, which was unusual because she only ever poured tea for herself. Placing the second cup in front of me was an announcement before she even opened her mouth. It said, "I am talking to you tonight as an equal, as someone who needs to know what you are carrying." She wrapped both hands around her cup and she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes, and she said, "There is a name inside you. Not a name you were given. A name you were born carrying. The way a river is born, carrying the memory of its source. You did not choose it. But it is yours, and it is real. And there are people in this world who would destroy you to take it from you." I remember the exact quality of the light that evening. Amber, falling sideways through the western window, making everything look like it was caught in the last moment before something changed. She told me what she could. The sealed name was an old thing. Older than the current pack structures. Older than the territorial boundaries that wolves had spent centuries fighting over. It belonged to a line that had existed before the modern alphas, a bloodline that carried a specific kind of authority, not just pack authority, the kind granted by strength and challenge and tradition. A deeper authority, the kind that the oldest records called blood right, the kind that could not be transferred, bought, or taken by force. It could only be inherited, and it could only be activated by the specific descendant in whose blood it lived. My mother had carried it. Before her, her mother. Before that, a line of women stretching back so far, the beginning was more legend than history. And now it lived in me. Sleeping, sealed, waiting in my blood like a coal that needed only the right breath of air to become fire. She told me there were those who knew of its existence and hunted its carriers. She told me that the sealing, the deliberate suppression of the bloodline signature, was the only protection. That was why my blood could not be tested. Tested blood would announce me to every powerful nose within 3 territories. I had carried this for 11 years without truly understanding what it meant. I had kept the name and hidden my blood and lived in obscurity, and it had felt like survival. Now, lying in the dirt of Thornfield, with my body refusing to obey me, I finally began to understand it differently. This was not random cruelty. Doran Voss had not collected me from Marin's Hollow because of some vague pack debt. He had brought me here because he was waiting for the seal to break. Because the seal, my mother had told me this in the same quiet, amber-lit voice, the seal was held in place by will. By the carrier's active, conscious choice to keep the name buried. The moment the carrier gave up, the moment they stopped holding the weight of it, the seal would crack. The name would surface. And anyone close enough, any wolf sensitive enough to bloodlines and ancient authority, would feel it happen like a bell ringing in a silent room. That was what Doran Voss was waiting for. 3 years of calculated cruelty, designed not to break my body, but to break my will, to make me stop holding, to make me let go. And tonight, the night I lay in the dirt, and my arm buckled and did not rise, tonight I had let go. I felt it happen like something physical. A deep, interior release, like a fist that had been clenched for 11 years finally, slowly, opening. The name rose. Not loud, not violent. Just upward, like smoke through still air, steady and inevitable, filling my blood with a warmth I had never felt before. A warmth that was old and foreign, and somehow, beneath all my pain and exhaustion, recognizable. Like a smell from a house you lived in before you were old enough to remember it. Like coming back to something you didn't know you had left. I pressed my cheek harder into the dirt, and I let it rise, and I felt the night around me change. The air pressure shifted. The insects went silent. And far above me, the bleeding red sky seemed to sharpen, as if every star in it had suddenly turned its attention to this one yard, this one woman, this one moment of breaking that was, somehow, also a beginning. In Doran Voss's study on the 2nd floor of the pack house, I would later learn every candle went out simultaneously. In the training yard, 3 senior wolves stopped mid-conversation and lifted their heads, their eyes going wide and uncertain, reaching for something they couldn't name. And beyond the mountains, in a place I had never seen, in a territory older and larger than anything Thornfield could imagine, a man with amber eyes was already moving, already breaking into a run through Silver Forest, already crossing distances that should have taken days in what would take him only hours. He did not know my name yet. He did not know my face. He only knew what his blood was screaming at him. She is there, and she is breaking, and if you do not move right now, you will arrive to silence. Chapter 5. The longest night. I don't know how long I lay there. Time moved strangely, the way it does when the body is deciding whether to continue. The yard was dark now, the red sky having finally darkened to the deep blue-black of true night, and the cold came up from the earth the way cold always does. Not from the air, but from below, from the ground itself, patient and thorough. My ribs were a single sustained note of pain, like a string held too tight on an instrument. My left eye was swollen nearly shut. My lip had dried and cracked and reopened twice. But none of that was the worst part. The worst part was the silence inside me where the fight used to live. For 3 years, that silence had been the enemy. I had filled it with counting, with my mother's words, with the wooden figures from Mattis's hand, with the bread smell that meant Wren had not completely abandoned her own conscience. Now the silence was simply there. open and wide, and I lay inside it like a stone at the bottom of a river, and I was too tired to be afraid of it anymore. Then I heard footsteps. Not Caden's heavy, purposeful stride. Not Doran's measured, controlled pace. These footsteps were light and fast, and clearly trying not to be heard, which in itself was information. I didn't move. Couldn't move. But I tracked the sound with my eyes, and in the thin moonlight I saw a figure cross the yard toward me. Small, moving low, carrying something. Thessaly Voss crouched beside me in the dirt, and she was breathing hard, like she had run from somewhere, and her face in the moonlight was stripped of its usual careful composure. What was underneath was younger and more frightened, and beneath the fear, fiercely resolved. She pressed something into my hands. A cloth. Damp with something cold and medicinal, calendula, I thought, and yarrow. Wren's work. Thessaly had gone to the medical stores herself. "Don't speak," she whispered. Her voice was barely air. "Don't move yet. He checks the yard at midnight. You have 40 minutes. She began carefully pressing the cloth to my face, and her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, without the distance I had kept between us, the careful emotional glass I had put between myself and anyone in this pack who wasn't actively hurting me. Because safety and kindness from the same house felt more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty I understood. Cruelty had a logic I could defend against. This girl kneeling in the dirt beside me at midnight, risking everything, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. This I did not know how to defend against. "Why?" I whispered. Not because I doubted her, because I needed to hear her answer. She paused. She looked at me and something moved across her face. That complicated expression from the kitchen corridor, finally allowed to finish arriving. "Because I've known for 2 years what my father is doing," she said quietly. "And I've been a coward for 2 years. And tonight something happened. I don't know what, but the whole pack house felt it. Every wolf in there went still. And I knew if I didn't come now I never would." She went back to tending my face. Her hands were still shaking. I lay there and let her work, and I thought about what she had said. The whole pack house felt it. Every wolf went still. That confirmed what I had suspected. The seal breaking was not a private interior event. It had broadcast itself into the world the moment I let go, which meant Doran Voss had felt it, which meant he knew. The timeline I had imagined, the vague, distant threat of his plans eventually coming to some head, had just collapsed into something immediate. Tomorrow morning, or perhaps before, he would come to this yard, and he would look at me with those patient chess player's eyes, and he would tell me that the game was over, that I had held the seal as long as I could, and now it was time to discuss what came next. He would be calm about it. He would offer me something, food, warmth, a room, the way you offer a horse a clean stable after you've finally broken it. And I would have nothing left to refuse him with, unless something changed, unless what I had felt moving beyond the mountains arrived before morning. Thessaly finished and sat back on her heels. The medicinal cloth had taken the worst of the swelling's heat down. I could almost open my left eye now. I looked at her and I made a decision, one of the last ones I had the energy to make. "Help me to the east wall," I said. She stared at me. "You can't walk." "Help me anyway." The east wall faced the mountains. I didn't know why I needed to face the mountains. I only knew I needed to, the way you sometimes know things that live below the level of reason, in the old animal part of you that doesn't explain itself. Thessaly put my arm over her shoulder, and she got me upright, and we moved together across the dark yard, step by painful step, until the stone wall was under my palms, and the mountains were dark shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the sky ahead. I pressed my hands flat against the cold stone. I closed my eyes, and I felt it, closer now, much closer, moving through the night with the absolute certainty of something that has only one direction left to travel. Chapter 6. What came through the trees. He came through the eastern tree line at 2 a.m. I know the time, because the pack-house clock had just struck twice, the sound drifting through the cold night like a stone dropped in still water. I was still at the east wall, though Thessaly had gone back inside 20 minutes earlier with a look on her face that said she was terrified and was going to do it anyway. Whatever it was she had decided. I stood against the wall alone, barely upright, one hand flat against the stone, the other pressed to my ribs. The forest beyond the wall was still and dense and dark. And then, it wasn't. Something moved at the tree line. Not small movement. Large, deliberate. The kind of movement that belongs to something that has stopped being cautious because it has arrived. He stepped out of the forest and into the moonlit open ground between the trees and the east wall, and the first thing I thought, before I knew who he was, before I understood anything, was that I had never seen a person take up space the way he did. Not physically large, though he was. It was something else. A density. A gravity. He stood in the open ground, and the world organized itself around him the way iron filings organize around a magnet. Not because he demanded it, but because it was simply the law. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark traveling clothes, with ash-dark hair and the amber eyes I had somehow already known about without ever being told. Those eyes found me immediately, not searching, found, as though my location had been given to him and he had simply followed directions. He crossed the open ground in long strides and stopped on the other side of the east wall, perhaps 6 feet from where I stood, and we looked at each other through the dark. Up close, he was younger than authority, like his had any right to be, perhaps 28, though his eyes held something that had no age in it at all. He looked at my face, at my left eye still swollen, at the split lip, at the way I was holding my ribs, and I watched something move across his expression. Not shock, not pity, something quieter and more absolute than either. It looked like recognition. It looked like fury distilled into complete stillness, the most dangerous kind of fury there is, the kind that has gone past noise into something cold and purposeful. "Seraphne Lowe," he said. His voice was low, even, but the sound of my name in his mouth felt like a door being kicked open in a room I had kept sealed for years. I straightened instinctively, which sent a bolt of fire through my ribs and almost took me back to the ground. His hand came over the wall and caught my arm before I fell. One hand, moving with the speed and precision of a born fighter. He steadied me and then kept his hand there, not gripping, just present. A steadiness offered, not imposed. I looked down at his hand on my arm and then up at his face. "You know my name," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. He studied my face with those amber eyes like he was taking inventory, or like he was containing something very large in a very controlled space. "I know more than your name," he said. "I've known what you're carrying for longer than you'd believe. I came as soon as the seal broke." A pause. I should have come sooner. And in those last 4 words was something unexpected. Not just authority, but something personal. Specific. Guilt. Behind me, the pack house lights began to come on. Not the warm, gradual light of people waking naturally, but the sharp, sequential light of a building alerting, room by room, floor by floor, like eyes opening down a long corridor. Someone had triggered the alarm. Whether it was the presence beyond the wall, or something Thessaly had done, or simply Doran Voss's sharp instincts detecting that his years of calculation were about to be interrupted, the pack was waking. I heard boots on floorboards, voices, the specific bark of command that meant ranked wolves being directed. I pressed my hand harder into the wall, and I looked at the man on the other side of it, and I understood with absolute clarity that the next few minutes were going to define everything. He was already scanning the pack house lights with those amber eyes, calm, measuring, absolutely unintimidated. Then he looked back at me and I saw the question in his expression before he asked it. Not asking permission exactly. Asking acknowledgement. Making sure I was present for what he was about to do. "My name is Calum Dre," he said quietly. "I am the Alpha King of the Ashbourne bloodline, and this pack has had its last night of touching what belongs to a line older than any authority Doran Voss has ever held." He said it without heat. Flat as a declaration carved in stone. Then he looked at my hands on the wall and said simply, "Can you step back?" I stepped back from the wall. He placed both hands on the top of it and vaulted over in one clean motion, landing silent on the yard's packed earth beside me. He straightened and turned to face the pack house, and behind us the forest was full of sound now. More movement, more gravity, the snap of branches under deliberate feet. He had not come alone. Of course he had not come alone. He looked at me one more time, briefly, with something in his expression that I did not yet have the vocabulary for. Then he walked toward the pack house door, and the door opened before he reached it, and Doran Voss stood in the frame, and for the first time in 3 years I watched that patient, calculating face show something other than control. It showed fear. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Doran Voss recovered quickly. I will say that for him. He was not a man who stayed afraid for long. He smoothed his face back to its familiar, composed surface within seconds, and stood in the pack house doorway, with his hands clasped behind him, like a man receiving an unexpected but not unwelcome guest. Behind him, I could see the shapes of ranked pack members filling the corridor, Caden among them, for once completely still, his usual restless arrogance nowhere visible. Doran's eyes moved from Calum Dre to me and back to Calum, and whatever calculation he was performing behind those eyes was rapid and thorough. Alpha King, he said, calm, acknowledging. Like the title was a chess piece he was choosing not to contest right now. I didn't receive word of your visit. You'll understand if Thornfield is not prepared to— Thornfield has 3 minutes to open its gate to my escort, Calum said. He had stopped perhaps 8 feet from the doorway. He stood with his hands at his sides in the total stillness of someone who does not need to perform authority because they simply are it. After 3 minutes, the gate opens from my side. The silence that followed was absolute in the way that only silence after a delivered ultimatum can be, filled with the sound of everyone who heard it, privately recalculating every assumption they had walked into this moment with. I watched Doran Voss's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. I watched Caden behind him go pale under his tan. I watched, further back in the corridor shadow, Thessaly Voss, who had positioned herself near the back wall, with her arms wrapped around herself, watching with those complicated eyes. She met my gaze for a moment, and what I saw was relief so profound it looked almost like grief. As though she had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time, and had only just now been allowed to set it down. I understood that feeling completely. I was feeling something adjacent to it myself, standing in the cold yard behind Calum Dre with my ribs on fire, and my swollen eye finally able to track detail, and the name in my blood burning warm and awake for the first time in 11 years. Doran made his decision. He stepped back from the doorway and made a short gesture to someone behind him. Moments later, the east gate opened. Calum's escort came through. 8 wolves, all bearing the Ashbourne mark on their gear, moving with the organized, unhurried purpose of a team that had done this kind of thing before. They took positions along the yard perimeter without drama or display. Calum watched them settle and then turned back to Doran, who had come down the steps now and stood in the yard, his composure fully restored, ready to negotiate. The girl is a pack ward under debt obligation, Doran said, measured, still trying to find the angle. Her situation is a matter of internal pack governance. The Ashbourne throne has no jurisdiction over— She carries a sealed name of Ashbourne bloodline, Calum said. That makes her jurisdiction a matter of crown law, not pack governance. You knew this. That's why you've had her for 3 years. The quiet certainty in his voice left no space for misdirection. Doran looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at me. And for the first time since I had arrived in Thornfield, there was nothing triumphant or calculating in his expression. There was only a man who had played a very long game and understood precisely that he had lost. Then Caden moved. I should have seen it coming. The recklessness of someone who understands that the controlled path has closed and has nothing left but impulse. He came through the doorway fast and low, and with the particular aggression of a man who has spent 3 years in unchallenged authority, and cannot accept that authority evaporating in real time. He wasn't going for Calum. He was going for me, the habit of 3 years asserting itself with mindless momentum. Because I was where his rage had always been directed, and some part of his animal brain had not yet received the message that tonight was different. I saw him coming, and I had a single second to realize that I was too broken to move, too slow, too hurt. And then Calum moved. I had heard the word fast used for wolves my whole life. I had seen fast in training yards and dominance displays, and the occasional territorial confrontation I had witnessed from distances. What Calum Dre was something different. He was between Caden and me before I processed his movement, and his hand was around Caden's wrist, and the sound Caden made was not a growl or a word, but simply an involuntary exhale, the sound a person makes when they have run, very fast, into a wall. Caden dropped to his knees. Not forced, his legs simply gave, the instinctive submission response of a wolf in the presence of overwhelming dominance. Calum held his wrist for one additional second, looking down at him with an expression of complete, cold dispassion. Then he released him and turned back to Doran. "Your son touched a woman under Ashbourne blood right," he said, in the same tone one might use to state an accounting error. "That is no longer a matter of governance. That is a matter of law." He paused. "And it will be addressed." He turned then and walked back to me, and he looked at my face with those amber eyes and said, quietly, so only I could hear, "You've been holding this alone for too long." It was possibly the most straightforward thing anyone had said to me in 11 years, and the simplicity of it hit me harder than any blow Caden had ever landed. My eyes burned. I did not cry. I was not ready to cry yet. But the burning was there, and I let it be there, because I was too tired to suppress even that. Chapter 8. What the name costs. They gave me a room in the pack house that night. Calum's escort made clear, without particular hostility but with absolute firmness, that I would not be returning to the basement cot. Ren Aldous came to the room within the hour, moving with the particular combination of guilt and relief of someone who has been waiting for permission they could not give themselves. She was thorough and careful. 3 cracked ribs, she confirmed, not broken, though the difference was a matter of degree that my body was not finding particularly comforting. The eye would fully open within 2 days. The lip would heal clean. She worked in silence for most of it, and I let her, and near the end she stopped and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and said, "I brought you bread." She said it like a confession. "I know," I said. "It kept me here some nights." She nodded, not looking at me, and finished her work and left. The wooden figures from Mattis were still in the pouch sewn inside my mattress, which had, I discovered, been brought up from the basement and placed on the room's proper bed without anyone needing to be told. Someone had been paying attention. Calum came to the doorway an hour before dawn. He knocked, which struck me because it was such a small courtesy, and small courtesies had been so completely absent from my life for so long that they registered now like sounds in a quiet room. I told him to come in. He stood in the doorway and didn't enter further, which I understood as deliberate, giving me the space, keeping the room mine. He looked at my bandaged ribs, the closed eye, and said nothing about any of it, which was the right choice. Instead he said, "I need to tell you some things about what you're carrying, things your mother may not have had time to explain fully." I looked at him. "She was thorough," I said. "She told me it was a sealed bloodline name. Ashbourne. Older than current pack structure. Blood right authority that can't be transferred." He considered this. "She told you more than I expected," he said. "What she may not have told you, because she may not have fully known, is what it activates when unsealed." He paused, and in the pause I heard the weight of something large approaching. "It doesn't just carry authority," he said. "It carries a claim. A specific claim, one that has been dormant since the last Ashbourne carrier chose to seal it rather than invoke it." He came further into the room then, though still careful with the space, and he sat in the chair near the window rather than anywhere closer, and he looked at me in that amber-eyed way that I was beginning to understand meant he was being very precise with his words, choosing each one individually. "The Ashbourne bloodline has been waiting for its heir for 60 years, he said. "My grandfather's mate, the last unsealed carrier, she died without invoking the claim. The Ashbourne seat has been held in Regency since then. Held for her heir, for whoever carried the name next. The room was very quiet. Outside, the sky was beginning its slow conversation with dawn, the first gray lightning along the mountain edges. When you let the seal break tonight, he continued, you didn't just surface the name. You invoked the claim. Ashbourne has an heir now. The seat has been waiting 60 years for what happened in this yard tonight. I sat with that for a long time. My ribs ached. My eye throbbed. In the cloth pouch inside my mattress, Mattis's carved wooden figures pressed their small shapes against my back through the bedding. I didn't know I was invoking anything, I said finally. I just stopped being able to get up. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was quiet and specific and difficult to name. I know, he said softly. That's usually how the most important things happen. I needed to ask him the question that had been living under everything since he had vaulted the east wall with his hands and landed silent in the yard beside me. I needed to ask it, not because I doubted the answer, but because I needed to hear it said aloud, in clear words, in this room, with dawn coming, and the mountains visible through the window, and 11 years of silence finally lifting. Why did you come yourself? I asked. You're the Alpha King. You could have sent anyone. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone constructing an answer, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true answer to give. Because the Ashbourne bloodline isn't just politically connected to my crown, he said. It's personally connected to my family. The last carrier, my grandfather's mate, she was my grandmother. He looked at me steadily. Which means you're not a political heir I came to collect, Seraphine. You're the closest thing to family the Ashbourne seat has had in 60 years. And I have known your name since I was old enough to understand what it meant. Outside, the first real light broke over the mountains. It came in gold and clean through the window, and it fell across the floor of the room where I was sitting, and I felt it like a hand placed gently on a wound that has been open for too long. Chapter 9. The weight of what was hidden mourning came to Thornfield like an audit, the kind that arrives quietly and leaves nothing unexamined. By the time the sun was fully over the mountains, Calum's escort had established a formal perimeter. A courier had been dispatched to the Ashbourne capital, and Doran Voss had been formally notified that his pack's treatment of a blood-right heir was a matter now under Crown review. I watched from the window as this proceeded with the efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this scenario, and I thought about how long he had been planning this approach. Not just traveling through the night, but carrying the contingency for this moment the way I had carried the name. Ready for the seal to break. Ready to move the moment it did. The difference between us was that his readiness had resources behind it. Mine had only survived on stubbornness and bread left under a door. I sat in my window and watched the morning proceed, and I felt something I had not felt in so long it took me time to identify it. Something quiet and steady and warm. Not happiness. Happiness was too complete a word for what a person feels the morning after their worst night. It was more like the sensation of a fever breaking. The absence of the thing that had been killing you, finally, actually absent. Thessaly came to my room just after breakfast, which had been brought to me on a tray, warm and complete, by a packhouse assistant who had not been able to meet my eyes. Thessaly could meet my eyes. She stood in the doorway, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her father's calculating eyes, and her mother's soft face. And she looked at me with the expression I had finally been able to decode. It was the face of someone who had been an accessory to something terrible, and had spent 2 years deciding whether to consider themselves guilty or simply afraid. I should have come to you sooner, she said. Not an apology performance, the real thing, flat and spare. Yes, I said. She nodded. That was all that needed to be said about it. She came in and sat in the chair Calum had used, and she said, My father is going to contest the blood-right claim. He's been preparing arguments for years, that the seal was voluntary, that voluntary sealing constitutes a renouncement. I looked at her. You know his arguments. She met my eyes. I know everything my father has planned for the last 3 years. I've been too frightened to do anything about it. I'm not frightened anymore. She paused. I'll testify. Whatever the Crown Review needs, I'll tell them everything. Caden's formal detention was the moment that broke something in the pack's collective silence. Up until that point, the Thornfield wolves who had watched my mistreatment for 3 years had maintained the specific, careful neutrality of people hoping to avoid being caught on the wrong side of a changing situation. When the Ashbourne escort formally detained Caden Voss in the presence of the full assembled pack, no force needed, Caden having apparently exhausted his supply of impulsive aggression in the yard the previous night, and now simply standing very still and very pale while formal charges were read. Something shifted. Old Mattis Howard walked across the yard to where I was standing near the east wall, and he stood beside me, and he watched the proceedings with those eyes that held 60 years of things he had not been able to stop. Then he reached into his coat pocket, and he produced one last carved figure, small, smooth, shaped like a woman standing upright, and he placed it in my hand and wrapped my fingers around it and said, with his voice rough as birch bark, "I knew your grandmother. She would be proud of how long you held." And that was when I finally cried. Not dramatically, just steadily, the way rain comes after a long drought, quiet, necessary, and absolutely without apology. The formal Crown Review convened in Thornfield's meeting hall that afternoon, with Calum presiding, and 3 senior Ashbourne advisors who had arrived by midday conducting the proceedings. The hall was full, every Thornfield pack member who could fit, crowded into rows, standing along walls. I sat at the table designated for the claimant, with Thessaly beside me as witness, and across the table, Doran Voss sat with 2 advisors of his own, and the composed face of a man who has lost, but has not yet admitted it. He presented his arguments about voluntary sealing. They were technically sophisticated and genuinely well prepared, and they landed in the room with the weight of years of careful construction. Then Thessaly spoke. She spoke for 40 minutes, clearly and completely, without notes, and what she described, the systematic approach, the deliberate cruelty designed to break will rather than body, the explicit discussions she had overheard between her father and his advisors about the sealed bloodline and how to unlock it, drained the technical sophistication from Doran's arguments, like water drained from a cracked vessel. When she finished, the room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when something that has been unsayable for a long time has just been said. Doran Voss looked at his daughter with an expression I will never forget. Not fury. Genuine shock. The shock of a man who has spent 20 years being the most calculating person in every room he entered, confronting the realization that he had been outcalculated by a 17-year-old girl who had simply been paying attention. Kylam looked at me across the table. I looked back at him. He said nothing. Didn't need to. The review board conferred for less than 20 minutes. Their ruling, read aloud in the formal language of Crown law, was unambiguous. The seal had not been voluntary renouncement, but a protective measure taken under threat, and its breaking under duress was not invocation by choice, but invocation by necessity, which carried full legal weight under the oldest recorded provisions of blood right law. Seraphine Lowe was recognized as the unsealed Ashbourne heir. The Thornfield Pack's 3-year detainment and treatment of a blood right heir was designated a formal Crown offense, and Doran Voss was placed under the same Crown Review as his son, pending full proceedings. He stood when the ruling was read. He looked at me once more, and whatever he had thought this ending would look like, this was not it. He had planned for everything. He had not planned for the breaking point to be the beginning. Chapter 10. What Comes After. Getting up, they gave me 3 days in Thornfield before the Ashbourne escort was ready to travel. 3 days that felt like a different kind of time than the 3 years before them. Not slow and grinding, but strangely spacious, as though the air itself had rearranged to make room for something that had been compressed for too long. Wren came back each day to check the ribs. On the second day, she also brought me something I hadn't expected. A simple meal, eaten together, at the packhouse table, in the main room, in front of everyone. She placed 2 plates down and sat across from me and said nothing for a moment, and then she said, "I want to know your name properly, not the ward name, your real name." I told her. She repeated it carefully. "Seraphine Lowe." She nodded, as though filing it somewhere permanent. "That's a name worth protecting," she said. I held that for a long time afterward. A name worth protecting. All the things you carry look different when someone outside your own head decides to acknowledge their weight. On the third morning, Calum came to find me in the east yard. The same yard? The same packed earth. I was standing near the spot where I had fallen for the last time, not because I needed to be morbid about it, but because I had wanted to stand there one more time while I still could, while the feeling was still fresh enough to be useful. He came and stood nearby, and he didn't say anything at first, which had become one of the things I appreciated about him. His silences were clean, not empty. He carried them without filling them unnecessarily. After a while, he said, "The Ashbourne seat isn't a palace. I want to be clear about that before we travel. It's a working governance, ongoing territorial negotiations, crown law cases, the practical business of keeping ancient agreements from falling apart in a modern world." He paused. "It's not a rescue to a comfortable place. It's a different kind of weight." I looked at the earth where I had lain, and I thought about weight. The weight of the name for 11 years, the weight of rising for 3 years, the weight of the seal and the secret, and the promise made to my mother's last breath. "I've been carrying weight since I was 11, I said. "What I haven't had is weight that meant something." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "It will mean something." We left Thornfield on the 4th morning, before full light. The escort assembled at the east gate, which had been my wall, the wall I had clung to, the wall Calum had vaulted over in the dark. And I passed through it as a gate rather than a barrier, and the distinction mattered more than I would have predicted. Mattis Howard was in the yard to see me go. He stood with his white birch cane and his 70 years of witnessed things, and he watched me walk past, and he said nothing, but his expression said everything that needed to be said. "I have been waiting to see you leave through the right door." I carried the small carved woman in my coat pocket, the standing figure, the last one he had made. I will carry it for the rest of my life. Thessaly was at the gate, too, and her situation was more complicated. She was still her father's daughter, and that would have consequences of its own, in the proceedings to come and in the years after. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and we didn't have the vocabulary yet for what we were to each other, but we both knew it was something, and we both knew it would continue. That was enough for now. The road out of Thornfield moved east into the mountains, and I had never been allowed to take it before, and I took it now in the gray pre-dawn, with the escort moving around me and Calum riding beside me, and the name in my blood burning clean and awake, and fully, finally, itself. We climbed for an hour, and then reached a pass where the mountains opened, and the view went wide, vast and silver-forested and enormous, the Ashbourne lands spreading out below us in the early light like a kingdom that had been waiting for someone to come home to it. I stopped my horse. I looked. I let myself look for a long time, without hurrying, without moving forward yet. Behind me was everything I had survived. Ahead of me was everything I had been carrying all along. The name had cost me my childhood, and my mother, and 11 years of hardship I would not wish on anyone. But standing here, at the top of the pass, with the mountains at my back, and the Ashbourne lands lit gold below me, and a man beside me who had run through the night because something ancient had finally screamed loud enough, I understood what my mother had known when she pressed her lips to my ear and gave me the last thing she had. She had not given me a burden. She had given me a destination. It had simply taken this long, and this much breaking, to finally arrive. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you felt something, drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Tell me your country and what time it is where you're watching. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the night you finally stop getting up might also be the night everything changes. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.